One of the things that we know about Africa is that because of the lack of written record, there isn't much that can be said about individuals. You would think because the information is less than other places, that this would mean that the very few are known, but they are not. For example, in Timbuktu, there is Ahmed ibn Sulaiman al-Rasmuki, Kash al-Hijab, Li Asfiya al-Abid, An Anjihat al-Rihab, Fi Mirafat al-Hisab. This person was a mathematician and a teacher, and in his works, he gives basic maths as an intro and then complicated maths, putting both his own input and spin on the individual understandings of mathematics. This is a paper that carefully details his assumptions on mathematics. Now remember, because he was raised in the Timbuktu areas and also had access to places like Mecca, which we will read, people from all over the world continued to go to that very same area. This is a writing from an Italian who happened to travel the same paths that most people who travel around Portugal go in order to reach places like India. And what he saw was the same as everybody else. So he says, I will tell you in what manner they live. A great part of their provisions comes from Cairo, that is, from the Red Sea. There is a port called Zidda or Judah, which is distant from the said city 40 miles. A great quantity of food also comes from Arabia Felix, and also a great part comes from Ethiopia. We found a great number of pilgrims, of whom some come from Ethiopia, some come from India Major, some come from India Minor, some from Persia, and some from Syria. Truly, I never saw so many people collected in one spot as during the 20 days I remained there. Of these people, some had come for the purpose of trade, and some on the pilgrimage for their pardon, in which pardon you shall understand what they do. This writing comes directly from Ludovico di Verthema. Ludovico di Verthema is only one of the writers that writes about the specific area, and he doesn't have a lot of good things to say about specific people since they were a colonizing force. And he represents the colonies and is very proud that the Portuguese had colonized some parts of the Swahili, namely a island which they called Mozambique, but it was different than the Mozambique that was occupied by the original inhabitants. And it is different from the country of Mozambique today. Going back to Ahmed al-Rasmuki, the mathematician that was in the 1600s and operated there inside of Timbuktu, Africa, we see that his contributions are not necessarily forgotten, for there are several mathematical designed websites or universities that give credit to his contributions to mathematics. Now, it's funny because this person is completely unknown in Africa. And obviously, he wrote in Ajami script and he wrote in the familiar languages of the time. This information is from MAA. MAA is the Mathematical Association of America. And here, from the Pennsylvania State University, this mathematician from Timbuktu is credited. They write, for over 1,000 years, beginning in the 11th century, Timbuktu, a city-state now in the West African country of Mali, was a vital trade center for the Northern Sahara region. It was also a site of Islamic scholarship with many libraries. Many of the manuscripts once found in the city have been destroyed by the ravages of time. Thus, it is rare to find a mathematical manuscript from the city early period. Explanations of the problems in arithmetic with examples, a commentary by the 17th century scholar Ahmed ibn Sulaim al Rasmuki, 1639, on the work of the medieval mathematician al Samlaili, provides its readers with a background in arithmetic and problem solving, as well as supplying a brief history of the development of mathematics. The page shown below depicts the numerals to be used. And you can see here they continue. Addition of multi-digit numbers is performed from the bottom of the list upwards, with the sum written at the top of the configuration. Now you can see the numbers that are used there look very similar to the numbers that are used today by people. You see there's 7, 8, and 9. This is because, of course, a lot of the numbers that come from the Islamic period end up inside of our numbers today. But not only do they end up there, but there's also a twist which were made by people of Timbuktu, which was then adopted later by the Europeans. As they mention in this website, there are plenty of other mathematicians who we have their papers but not their names because partially they were destroyed and all that was left were the works. And then there are some where we have names because they are mentioned by other people, but we don't have their works, which makes it very difficult to try and give any kind of attention to that type of information. I could list probably 20 mathematicians that are listed in sort of censuses in Timbuktu, although these would not necessarily count as censuses. They're more like registrars or attendances. This high level contribution to mathematics is something that is underappreciated by the world. And again, like I said, because there's such few remaining papers from these areas, you would think that they would pay extra attention to the very few that exist before they themselves disappear. There are two astronomers who are found still in good shape till today. One is by Nasar al-Din Abu al-Abbas, who writes a book about the stars. The other is al-Shira al-Yamina wa ma yazaru min hawadith, who also wrote about the stars, but he was more concerned about their movements in his book, The Rise and Fall of the Stars. This he took, or at least he expanded on the works of the ancient Greeks. This happened a lot under the Islamic world. So, firstly, under Islam or the early Islamic world, the stars were studied because, of course, they still believed that the stars governed the way that things work today in a much deeper way than a lot of people do with astrology. So it's not just your moon rise, it's a whole host of things. Remember as well that each area of the stars could be assigned to specific people. So, for example, we can see in Al Masudi's book that the credit for the people, the black people of Africa, is given to Saturn, the planet. Obviously, not the god, since they believed in Islam and they had one god. And this history of taking the religion of the Greeks, converting it to pure astrology, and then throwing away the religious side is something that just happened and was believed for a very, very long time by Muslim scholars, even those who were in Timbuktu. This also was believed by European scholars. This is where we know that it goes from the Islamic world to the Europeans and everybody else around the world. By the way, it's not that the Europeans were special; that the Muslims were like, oh, check this out, and gave it directly to the Europeans. As you can see, they gave a lot of these would end up in Africa. They would end up in libraries in East Africa, in West Africa, in Ethiopia, that end up in India, Yemen, of course, in the Middle East, Persia, and places like that. Even as far away as Korea, some of these ideas were seen. China, obviously, is another one. Now, this is what one of the ideas that is given about Negroes and the planets and how they relate to the planets, the heavenly bodies. This tells you a couple things. One, science was still mixed in with religion heavily, meaning that you could not escape it in the past. They didn't even think to break them apart, except for the skeptics. We'll get to that because there were some skeptics in Timbuktu, just like there were skeptics in the Middle East. Remember the black librarian who was of Zanj history, or at least of Sudan history, and he wrote those books about the superiority of the blacks over the whites, including the Indians. And he documented that normal people will give their opinions on every single thing that has to do with religion, but they not for a second will give you a real fact about science, because that is more difficult to have an opinion on than to go off on religion. If we read Al Masudi's version, which will not necessarily reflect the version from Timbuktu, it says, spoken on the causes under the influence in which the Negroes are placed, and they entered upon their position relative to heaven, the seven planets, and particularly the five planets which preside over their development and have alone influenced upon the formation of their bodies. But this book is not solely devoted to the subject. We state here only the facts as they have been advanced by various authors. So keep in mind, the thing that this person is saying is that these are actual facts. Referring for further details and an exposition of their arguments in proof of those facts to our book Akbar Examen. We have also explained in our book the theory of those astrologers and astronomers who ascribe the character of the Negroes to Saturn, as this is expressed in the verses of some modern Muhammadan writer. One of them, the planets, is Saturn, who is an old man and a powerful king. His complexion is black, and this is the color of his dress and of his sulky mind. He exercises his influence upon the Zanj and the slaves, and to him lead and iron are sacred. So you can guess that this interpretation would not be the same for the people living in Timbuktu, as there's a little bit of a racism thrown in there. In order to interpret some of the words written by the astrologers and the astronomers, you would need a philosopher. This philosopher engaged in things like philosophy, natural philosophy, which is what they used to call it back in the day. This is very different, by the way, than any version that has to do with the religion. So the astrology section that is to do with religion, that would be interpreted by people who are religious. This person, Saif al-Din Ali ibn al-Amdi, we'll leave it there. This person was responsible for philosophy, and he studied all kinds of philosophy. In his book, he writes that he will address philosophy of people who already exist. So, in other words, he is not necessarily creating his own philosophies, which he does, but he's not necessarily doing it, but he is judging the philosophies of people who came before him in Timbuktu, which tells us there were a lot of philosophers living in Timbuktu as well. Not only is he judging these people's philosophies and how they see the world, but he also has a part where he's judging the religions. So interpreting the religions, let's say less judging. This is a very important yet dangerous part in history to do, because if you interpret it wrong and you start a school of thought that could go in a direction, it could cause a lot of troubles, as there are many people who try to mediate or even legislate against uh, the persecution of people's opinions over the religion, which you can guess in Islam, you had to sort of do it the right way, or you were basically going against the way things should work. Medicine also was a thing, and Sayyid Ahmad ibn Amr al-Rakidi al-Timbuktu al-Kunti was a medical practitioner, and he wrote about a lot of the cures, a lot of the diseases that existed in his time. But Al Kunti was not just a doctor, he also engaged in the wars that were happening at the time, which he noticed against the Tuareg and other people, including the Songhai and the Mandinka. Here's an interpretation of those writings by those several people back then about the Tuareg and the warring tribes of the Songhai and the others. This writing here is from a website called publicationcodesria.org. And this is their commentary on what was said. The internal affairs of the Tuareg, intertribal wars, inherited disputes, as well as the relationship with Timbuktu and with the groups that had formed part of its history, especially the Arma, Songhai, and the Puels. The Tadmaket Tuaregs were held in the position of the Kasi vassalage by the Arma for a long period of time, but they managed to reverse the power relationship in their favor, beginning in the harsh defeat inflicted on the Arma in Tagia in May 1737. From this date, and for several decades, they asserted themselves as major participants in the politics and military life of Timbuktu and its hinterland in the upper Niger River basin. The assassination of their chief, Ogmar, by the Arma resulted in the siege of Timbuktu in 1755. Sheikh Sidi al Mukhtar successfully assisted the Tadmaket in lifting the siege. He had intervened in the inheritance disputes that arose after the deaths of Ogmar and his son and successor Abtiti, and for this reason, Sidi Muhammad's Kitab al Tara, if presented him as the true orchestrator of the complicated system of succession within the Iwelemendin, the different Tuareg tribes. Sidi Muhammad also credited Sheikh Sidi al Mukhtar with a device influence over the devolution of the chief trainship among the Brabish, with whom the Kunta sometimes had a difficult relationship, mainly because of the tax pressure they placed on the trade to Timbuktu. Now, I just wanted to throw that in there because I will be doing a longer video on the warring tribes in that area. So, this is the final part of this video. But I want to say this: we have names, places, notes, interpretations, translations, and all kinds of things that show that these people contributed not only to the modern world, but also in some cases, they contradict information. Like some maths is thought to have been discovered later by Europeans in another date, but when reading the Timbuktu manuscripts, they show us a different picture, which I did try to get some of the documents from a Qatari uh, organization, but I got banned. And this Qatari organization collected a lot of information about Timbuktu and the historical relations between Timbuktu notes and European notes. By the way, that's advice for anyone who's very curious about Timbuktu because it was such an international thing, because it was such an international civilization. You will find information about Timbuktu in India, in Yemen, in Qatar, in Oman, in anywhere you want around the world. Don't just rely on European sources. And thanks to the modernization, South Africa has a whole host of translations of Timbuktu manuscripts. Now, I could dry read most of them, but again, most of them are religious in nature. And I think most people find religion pretty boring, and they don't add much historically in terms of like telling us exact things. I could cover them in small factors like how is it different from this or that. Like for example, documents that I found from that same Qatari uh, website showed me that most of the black people who lived in Iran used to be Sunni. There is also a long fable from Iran that, well, there's actually many fables, but there's one specific fable from Iran that includes people from the Zanj, where a Persian comes from Persia and meets the love of his life in the Middle East, and then that person says they'll take them to Greece, and then from Greece they go to this from the Middle East they go to the Swahili coast, not realizing that this person did not take them to Greece. He says, well, this is strange. Why is everyone around here black, but you're white? It's an interesting story. You will see it in another time. I just need to make sure I pack it out right. Thank you very much. Like, share, subscribe, donate, become a member, jump over the moon, whatever you got to do. Thank you very much.